Hello fellow explorers, and welcome to the Psychic Jungle. This is the podcast of alternative transmissions. The concept of Shambhala is not limited to Tibet alone. You could say it is a worldwide phenomenon, rather like the Grail mysteries or fabled Xanadu. There is always time in legend to paint a picture in our minds of faraway lands that hold paradise or untold riches for those brave enough to seek them. Whether the lands are real or map the territories of inner space is the crux of the matter, as we saw in episode 3. Modern geographers would perhaps quickly dismiss Shambhala as the fantasies or superstitions of more primitive times. But as we have found and said earlier, traditionally Central Asian peoples believe Shambhala exists physically as well as metaphysically. One of those who attempted to penetrate the mystery with some success was the eccentric Russian explorer Nicholas Roerich, aided by his wife Helena. The couple were initiates of the theosophical path of Madame Blavatsky. The Roerich legacy includes a work entitled Shambhala, the Resplendent. Born in 1874 in St. Petersburg, Nicholas Roerich was something of a genius. Some might say a polymath, as he studied painting and the arts, literature, poetry, archaeology, philosophy. He was, in his age, something of a Renaissance man. He, like Blavatsky and Gurdjieff, were caught up in the occult revival of the last quarter of the 19th century in Europe. Trained as both a painter at the Imperial Academy of Arts in Russia, he also studied law at St. Petersburg University. He came to prominence in the Russian imperial capital. Roerich travelled widely, his influences, diverse as they were, arcane. His painting was well received, and he is noted widely as an important artist of Russia's ancient past. His own work was hung in the Louvre, National Museum in Rome, with exhibitions in every major European capital. He became an art director in 1906, being hailed as something as innovative genius in media at the time. In the arts, he contributed stage sets to several major ballets. Interestingly, he was one of the first generation of conservationists, concerning himself with the preserving of architecture in places of historical interest, in a forerunner for later organisations such as UNESCO. He and his wife Helena developed a deep interest in theosophy and Eastern mysticism during the early 20th century. Their story is a very unusual one because they were recipients of a fragment of meteorite with holy inscriptions carved upon it in a language which is unknown. How the stone arrived at the Roerich's household is shrouded in almost melodramatic secrecy and mystery, according to Russian authority Andreev in his book The Myth of the Masters Revived, The Occult Lives of Helena and Nikolai Roerich. The story unravels that Nicholas Roerich received a notice on the October 6, 1923, from the American Bank or Bankers Trust, stating that he and his wife had been left a small package. In fact, it turned out to be a wooden casket containing an inscription on it, and it said, "De la part M.M." Inside the casket, that was heavily scented, was a shrine wrapped in a purple-red cloth, and on that inscribed figurines, spheres, and other symbols. As they took the shrine from its cloth, they discovered the letter adorned by leaves. The shrine itself emanated a heat that all present felt. Later, the relic materialized and became known as the Black Stone. As the Roerichs were dyed-in-the-wool theosophists, the letter M adorned by leaves was of course taken to be Mahatma Maurya, as we've mentioned in the previous episode, which is an ascended master of Madame Blavatsky. Other theories about the artefact put forward that high-ranking Masonic sponsors of Roerich had arranged the delivery, and there was a mystical apport or materialization of some kind that took place. Andreev, in his tale, explores the theme of the Black Stone in some detail, quoting historian Rosov, who recounts that the stone had passed through the hands of Napoleon and Josephine before disappearing, and it had a role to play in history, being kept for safety by a Parisian secret sect, the Prieurs de Sion. This sliver of meteorite thus came into the possession of the Roerichs. Photographs of the Cintamani, as it's known, were taken shortly after its appearance, and They feature in one of Rorke's paintings, a very famous painting called Cintamani, the treasure of the world. Henry A. Wallace, who later became Vice President of the USA, was a high-ranking Mason and ardent supporter of Roerich, and who was heavily influenced by the artist himself. Wallace wrote letters to Roerich mentioning the stone, and he believed that it had a bearing on the fortunes of great nations. The ill-starred international organization, the League of Nations, was also influenced by the irresistible Russian painter Roerich in his efforts to preserve history and cultural assets during times of warfare, unveiling the Roerich Pact in 1930, which was in some sense the precursor to UNESCO. Certain commentators have since said that the League of Nations leaders were instrumental in funding his first Central Asian expedition. Democratic Party member Wallace was head of agriculture for the USA in 1934, and he heard about Roerich's ideas, supported as they were by several leading scientists, Macmillan and Stevens, and found it was easier to persuade the Americans to fund further expeditions in Central Asia, albeit under the auspices of soil exploration. Roerich set off to lead a team of American explorers into the depths of Central Asia. He recorded much of this in his book, Altai Himalaya. Like many before him, he chose the way of entry into the mountainous regions via the perilous passes of Sikkim into Punjab, Kashmir, Ladakh, then the Karakorams, then bearing north-eastwards into Khotan, later Kashgar, and finally into Mongolia. This was the Altai Mountains, of course, the name of his book. Later the expedition went into central Mongolia, and finally, after a detour into Siberia, went over to Tibet. Like many other expeditions, his was not free of harsh conditions on the dizzying treks and the snow-laden passes. He'd been only 2 years on the roof of the world when the final leg inside Tibet ran into further troubles, with the party being seized by the authorities and held prisoner. It is little wonder the expedition ran into trouble in such a volatile region, as the intelligence services from Russia, Japan, Britain and the USA were all vying for control and influence within this region. During his incarceration in abject conditions, 5 of his party passed away. After 5 months their release was granted, and they once again crossed into India. Roerich continued undeterred, starting the Himalayan Research Institute and becoming increasingly involved in the international affairs dedicated to peace. In 1929 he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and twice again in the 1930s. His contacts included American President Hoover, Vice President Henry A. Wallace, as we've said, but also Indian President Indira Gandhi, daughter of Nehru, Trisila, head of the Russian Secret Service, and many high-ranking US heads of department. Returning to the expedition into Central Asia, many remarkable accounts of it are revealed. One such account, recorded in 1927, is the sighting of an oval flying craft spotted in Mongolia that shone like the sun, with it crisscrossing the sky at great speed before making a 45-degree turn and shooting off into the skies. Lamas present at the spectacle told Roerich that the incident was a sign of Shambhala, and its ruler, Rigden Jaipo, gave his blessing for his expedition. Some researchers have gone on to comment that the phenomenon may give a clue to the metaphysical manifestations of a higher form of being rather than existing in a purely physical sense. Again, we touch on Shambhala and some of the things that we said in the previous episode. This, of course, predates the so-called phenomenon of UFO sighting, which did not become popular for another 20 years. An aspect of this expedition, both peculiar and unique, was the carriage of the Tibetan sacred artefact known as the Cintamani stone, this holy relic, the black stone, sacred to Hindus, Jains and Buddhists, according to Roerich. By repute, the Cintamani stone had its origins in the constellation of Orion, or more specifically, the dog star Sirius. In Masonry, Sirius is the blazing star, and while the sun keeps our world warm and alive, it is said that Sirius feeds the spiritual world. The all-seeing eye is associated with the blazing star, and so Roerich's mission to return to the Tibetan people this sacred stone. Whatever the case, Roerich was far too eccentric for the world of politics, and his real aspirations came to the fore once he was back on his old stomping grounds, the roof of the world. At the source of Roerich's master plan to undermine the Dalai Lama as ruler of Tibet was the old prophecy that a future Panchen Lama, or the great scholar as it's called in Tibetan, would one day rule Shambhala. In some ways it could be said that the Dalai Lama was more civil in stature, and the Panchen Lama, due to his status and connection with several sacred monasteries, was of a higher order, at least spiritually. The abbots of a place called Tashilhunpo, by repute, were thought to be reincarnations of the Amitabha Buddha, one of the highest spiritual beings in the Buddhist pantheon. It was this rivalry between the two spiritual heads which had often simmered in the background of Tibetan history and politics. There is no doubt that Roerich deliberately thought to exploit this enmity. During this time, the semi-autonomous tax-free Panchen Lama was subject to a number of new initiatives to limit his sphere and influence, and this was put in place by the Dalai Lama of the time. During 1923, a situation arose that the Panchen Lama, fearing the worst, decided to flee Mongolia. The same year that Cintamani appeared to the Roerich household. 12 years later, Roerich, driven by his own secret agenda, one very similar to Dorjev, who we've mentioned in previous episodes, a plan to unite the Buddhist peoples of Central Asia under one flag. The genesis of this plan, laid a decade before, was conceived during his last sojourn in the region in the 1920s. At this time, Roerich met up with secret policeman and head of foreign espionage, a Bolshevik named Mir Tresele, to outline his plan of a communist-Buddhist alliance. Initially, the Bolsheviks supported Roerich. Like Dorjev before him, Roerich soon found that the Bolsheviks themselves had no real appetite for Buddhism and no interest in the expedition as such. The Bolsheviks had won their bloody civil war in Europe, but the resisting White Army factions supporting monarchism, capitalism, and odd factions favouring alternative socialism still had their troops in Central Asia. Roerich's bizarre geopolitical schemes may explain why he and his fellow explorers were imprisoned by the Tibetan authorities for 5 months in Lhasa during 1928. Upon his release from the arrest in Tibet and subsequent return to India after the debacle, Roerich and his fellow detainees were received by the British colonial lieutenant in Sikkim, India. The host, while genial and sympathetic to the plight of the beleaguered, weary travellers, noted of Roerich his rants about finding Shambhala, the heartland of the ascended Mahatma Moya. The lieutenant formed the opinion that the Russian was not a Bolshevik revolutionary or spy, only one of life's harmless eccentrics. Roerich died in 1947. However, his correspondence with Vice President Wallace was published the following year and proved to be anything but harmless. Time magazine printed the notorious Guru letters and completely wrecked Wallace's bid for president, leaving his political campaign in tatters. Wallace may have been esoteric collateral damage in Roerich's eccentric mystical life, and the great game played out by Russia and Britain after World War I by the 1920s in the roof of the world was still a hotbed of intrigue and international rivalry. During the 1920s, the Bolshevik army began fighting the White Russians in places, and the Chinese and Soviets went head-to-head in a bloodthirsty war that broke out in Mongolia. The conflagration was dubbed the Shambhala War and was at the heart of Roerich's keen interest in the region. The people of Mongolia have long been Lamists and looked towards Tibet as their spiritual home, devolving much political power to the Dalai Lama in Lhasa. By the early 1920s, the Bolsheviks and the newly formed Soviet Union eyed their eastern territories jealously and saw a chance to occupy the semi-autonomous Mongolia. At the time, a political vacuum occurred due to the demise of Chinese imperial power in the region. The outgoing Qing dynasty, backed by Imperial Japan, held sway there through ham-fisted diplomacy. Its genesis lay in the Chinese reluctance to accept Lamist influences, which is carried on to this day. Mongolia saw its traditional Mongolian Buddhist leader, called Bogd Khan, effectively held under house arrest, while the Chinese and their Japanese backers decided what to do with Mongolia. Something should be said about Bogd Khan of Mongolia to explain his standing among his countrymen, as he was rather like Dalai Lama. if you will, as both men were seen as spiritual leaders and by their selection were considered something called tulku, or reincarnated masters, sitting on old dynastic Buddhist thrones. As part of their legacy, both tulku were thought to be reincarnations of the Buddha himself. So you can see their standing and importance. To say their standing in the region was immense, both inside their own countries and the entire Lamanistic world, is an understatement. The Bogd Khan was a living god. The Bogd Khan also used the traditional title of Jebsundamba. As such, the Bogd Khan was immensely popular with his people, but not so the Chinese and Tibetan authorities, who found his aspirations for a restoration of Mongolian fortunes, with all of its adoration of the triumphant conqueror Genghis Khan, somewhat disconcerting. Chinese troops entered Mongolia during 1919, which set those nationalistic ambitions into immediate decline. Chinese guards held the Bogd Khan prisoner at his own palace, his rule reduced to a titular title in name only. We might stop here to consider that some of the Chinese did not want to start a war with Mongolians, as they had millions of lamas inside their own borders. So it suited them just to hold the Bogd Khan incommunicado in his own palace while controlling his affairs. The Oriental practice of the time was to send a doctor to the court of the prisoner ruler once he had fulfilled his purpose and aid him to reincarnate quite quickly, i.e. poison him. Several Dalai Lamas themselves had been dispatched in this way. When the Chinese were concerned about the health of the Mongolian leader, Bogd Khan, sending a doctor into his palace, this sinister move meant that the stage was set for a major confrontation. The Mongolian leader took the hint, and Tibetan troops, armed with bows and arrows, liberated him from his palace to pursue studies in monasteries in outlying places, i.e. he fled in fear of his life. Quite unexpectedly, the Mongolian leader, Bogd Khan, unwittingly found himself an unlikely ally in an Estonian nobleman dubbed the Mad Baron. Born of German ancestry, Baron Roman Nikolai Maximilian von Ungern-Stonberg, the Mad Baron, a pan-monarchist who hated Bolshevism and international Jewry. He was a military man who'd come to Central Asia to align himself with the Lama's cause. In one night, he and his band of troops had liberated the Bogd Khan from house arrest in order to help him restore his independence from China. This independent military intervention in international affairs is quite unthinkable in our own age, but it happened in Mongolia. This new ally of the Bogd Khan, dubbed the Mad Baron, was both a convert to Tibetan Buddhism and a sworn enemy of Bolshevism, a combination that made him a fierce advocate for the Mongolian throne and its restoration. The Mad Baron, like Rurik and his emissary Dorje, all believed wholeheartedly in restoring Central Asia to the Buddhist cause, and by default handing over this power to Russian influence once again. In effect, all three were involved in the Great Game. It is most likely that, in the case of Rurik's case, he delivered the Cintamani stone to either the Panchen Lama or the Bogd Khan coterie with full support for this holy war. As for the Mad Baron, he drew heavily on the Shambhala mythos that predicted that a general would come to fight the forces of evil and deliver mankind once again into the Dharma. The Mad Baron believed himself to be the legendary leader from Shambhala called the Kalki, a harbinger of destruction to those opposed to the Dharma. The Mad Baron saw himself as a military general born of Shambhala, who was prophesied to restore enlightenment to the world. He was not averse to going native and wearing Mongolian attire, which added to his already colourful image. Oddly enough, the Shambhala war was a conflict with an overriding spiritual mission, perhaps the closest Buddhism has to the Islamic concept of jihad, marshalled as it was by an aristocratic cavalry officer whose views were vehemently opposed to the revolution and rebellious towards the White Army. He chose to use his Cossack training to lead an independent force. His ultimate aim, equally eccentric as Rurik, was to restore the empire of the Mongolian Genghis Khan and reinstate the Romanov dynasty back in St. Petersburg. It was this initiative that led him to support Bogd Khan and try and restore him back to the Mongolian throne. This plan was ill-starred, although it received Japanese backing, with a series of Chinese warlords being party to the plan. Eventually they lost ground and abandoned the region. The Mad Baron withdrew to Manchuria, where he, in his eccentric style, married a local princess named Ji, but only to curry favour. Their marriage cemented contacts in imperial circles, including the notorious warlord Zhang Zuolin, a man who ruled Peking, which is now today Beijing. His nuptial alliance further fueled the Baron's reputation for the outlandish. His legacy is on one level romantic, but certainly not dashing. Though he was a Buddhist, he showed no compassion for Jews that he executed in cold blood. Historians have never remembered him kindly. The Mad Baron was not shy about hanging his enemies from trees, roasting them alive. It would be accurate to describe Stromberg as ruthless and despotic, but even this was an understatement. His leadership of his troops came to a head in Mongolia when some of his troops wanted to give up war and join Russian émigrés in Manchuria. The Baron had ideas to retreat instead into Tibet. A mutiny occurred and saw his officers killed, with an assassination attempt on his own life. Although he survived this attack, only 3 days later the Mad Baron was captured by the Red Army. In the autumn of 1921, he finally tasted his own medicine, as he was tried by the Communists, found guilty, and the very next morning executed by firing squad. The Bogd Khan, upon hearing the news of his friend's death, the warlord aristocrat, had prayers said throughout Mongolia to honour his liberator and dead commander. The politics of Tibet and Mongolia have always been a little bit similar because they're inextricably linked to the politics in China, and China being the dominant force for many centuries, as it is today. The Chinese, therefore, wanted to put a halt to this Bogd Khan and Lamist rule of Mongolia, and so the communist rulers formed a People's Republic, forbidding another Tulku to rule the kingdom. However, in 1932, the Panchen Lama in Tibet launched an offensive to attack the new Mongolian atheists, and this became known Shambhala War. It was an offensive that Rurik gave his wholehearted support for under the auspices of this botanical expedition. What is rarely told or connected to the Shambhala War is why it may have been started in the first place, which has its roots in the secret plans of the masters of the region, particularly the Tibetan Lamists. During 1932, a new Bogd Khan, or Tulku, was found inside Tibet, although this event was not announced to the world at large until the fall of communism in the Soviet Republic some 50-odd years later. This Bogd Khan was installed within the Tibetan Mongolian Lamist circles, albeit secretly. It was only in 1991, after the fall of communism, when democracy was once again restored to Mongolia, the 9th Jetsamdamba was formally enthroned in India in 1991 by the Dalai Lama, and later another coronation was performed in the Mongolian capital, Ulaanbaatar, in 1999. This discovery of the infant Tulku, Bogd Khan, during 1932 was known only to Tibet's highest spiritual authorities, but kept secret from all outsiders. Yet Rurik had enough influence to be on the inside of the Mongolian Lamist circle to be privy to their state secret. But why was he informed? In these episodes we've talked about the Masters of Wisdom and their standing inside the Himalayas. We've shown some evidence in previous episodes, physical evidence, of the existence of the Masters, i.e. the monk who was perfectly preserved for over the best part of a century, 20th century, and who was exhumed fully intact, uncorrupted body. But now we have other evidence from foreign travellers inside Tibet, Mongolia, the Himalayas, who've encountered some of the deepest practices of the Tibetans and have travelled there and been able to report them back to us in the West. And this is a very curious tale. Besides Shambhala, another kingdom exists, and was investigated by a Polish adventurer 1 year before Rurik managed to step foot on the roof of the world. The Pole was a man equally as indefatigable as any who'd come before him, and his name was Ferdinand Ossendowski. His name is more associated with another hidden kingdom, apart from Shambhala, and it went by the name of Agathi. The mythical kingdom has been spelt variously: Agartha, Agartha, Agarthi, Agati, and the more besides, I'm sure, as you travel to different places on the Silk Road. Primarily, Agathi or Agartha, is an underground realm which features in the legends and tales of the Central Asian region, formed of a tunnel network, sometimes constructed by the inhabitants, sometimes as a result of geological features. Although part of the structure has been swept away by past catastrophes, it's said, Agartha is similar to Shambhala in one respect, that it is seemingly only accessible to the initiated and become a vast repository of sacred knowledge that guards the very nature of mankind's origins, going back before the Great Flood. As with Shambhala, it's ruled by a king calling himself the King of the World. We mentioned him earlier. Agathi was first brought to public attention in 1873 by a Frenchman called Louis Jacquelet, whilst in India. He spelt it as Asgartha, describing it as the solar capital of India. He equated this legend with the caste system of 3 Aryans, saying that the Asgardians had initiated the warrior caste into their rites. It was another Frenchman who wrote Mission de l'Inde in 1886 that Agathi began to capture the Western interest, and it was this legend that Polish voyager Ferdinand Ossendowski really capitalized on, and he investigated this tale. His account, called of his journey on the roof of the world, is as curious as those before, but far stranger, eliciting greater uncertainty in the Western minds that such places like Agathi might not exist after all. Perhaps Ossendowski is all the more audacious in our eyes because he claims such direct knowledge of Agathi. Reading his journal, we are confronted with a travelogue which encounters huge unexplained sources of light, with columns beaming up to the night sky in a region which at that time had no electricity or generators and was far south of the Northern Lights phenomenon. He talks of a group of indigenous people called the Hazaras, who were tall people with long hair and beards, whose aspect he likened to Hindus that lived in the mountains with a special remit to protect Agathi. His tale is one of charming discovery, and yet an untapped resource. Ossendowski had met with both the Mad Baron, whom he joined acting as military intelligence officer, and the palace officials serving the Bogd Khan. His account of meeting with the Mongolian living god, or Buddha, is curious, and he reflects a great understanding of the local spiritual allegiances and delicate politics between China, Tibet, and the Mongolian peoples, but also provides solid evidence of the strong belief in the existence of Agathi. In the great palace of the Bogdo, a lama showed me a special casket covered with a precious carpet, wherein they keep the bulls of the Dalai and Tashai lamas, the decrees of the Russian and Chinese emperors, and the treaties between Mongolia, Russia, China, and Tibet. In this same casket a copper plate bearing the mysterious sign of the King of the World and the chronicle of the last vision of the living Buddha lay side by side. In his account of travels in the region during 1921, Ossendowski is taken inside a temple, ornately fashioned, having one wall painted yellow. It was explained by a Mongolian lama that the yellow paint denoted a place where someone special had once lived. He was taken further inside the monastery building, seeing the opulent surroundings, including a throne surrounded by 4 chairs. His guide told his Polish guest that one night during winter Several horsemen arrived and gathered locals to the room. A stranger then mounted the throne to reveal his head from under his cap. All present fell to their knees, recognizing from the sacred bulls of the Dalai Lama and Bogd Khan the supreme ruler of humanity, the so-called King of the World. After blessing those present and praying according to Tibetan custom, the King of the World then gave out a series of prophecies for the next half-century. This event was not dated by Ossendowski, although others have stated that it took place in approximately 1890, foretelling the start of the First and Second World Wars and the great suffering to come. A comforting rider that once the evil forces think they have control of the earth, the King of the World will begin his liberation of humanity. The Mongolian Lama finished his tale. He said the King of the World and his entourage simply disappeared, and the only evidence that it had ever been there were the depressions in the folds of the silk which remained on the throne. It seems that men like Rurik, the Mad Baron, and to some degree Ossendowski were greatly impressed by these legends of Shambhala and Agati and acted accordingly. Ossendowski finishes his account at the temple by saying that he had visions of his own family blending in with the incense smoke as the Lama prayed for his relations. As the incense smoke visions dissipated, the smoke disappeared behind a Buddha statue. His visualization stopped, but Ossendowski makes the point that others present also saw the same mental images, demonstrating that his psychic experience had a level of objectivity. All three Russians have accepted the mystic faculties of the Lamas as reality, whilst initiates like Blavatsky, Trungpa, and to some degree Gurdjieff insisted on the spiritual hegemony of the ascended masters, better known as Shambhala to some, and their ability to guide the destiny of humanity. Suggestions as to the location of the secret entrance of the lost subterranean world of Agathi are legion. Ossendowski related that he'd been told by Lamas that one entrance was beneath the Potala Palace in Lhasa, while other explorers suggested various sites in remoter areas of Tibet. With such strict taboos on revealing its location, which include cutting out the tongues of those talking about it, the precise locality of Agathi remains as mysterious as its king. It would seem in this volatile region that the masters have been at work to preserve their teachings against the joint incursions of Bolsheviks, Chinese communists, and expansion of Western colonists. But it now seems to make perfect sense for the masters to inject their esoteric teachings into the West, where it might be nurtured and preserved. The question is, did Rurik actually reach Shambhala, and what happened to the Cintamani stone? I don't suppose we'll have any direct answers, but there are clues in his mysterious paintings, and he is the world's foremost painter of mountain scenery, which we didn't mention earlier. Are the clues in his paintings? Some of those mountain ranges can actually be recognized, and the themes are always mystical. Are these clues as to what happened? And as we know, he did actually paint a picture entitled Cintamani. Some people have wondered whether Rurik actually penetrated Shambhala itself and returned the stone to the immortals. Now some might find this too fantastical, but of course he did have an intimate connection with the Lamas who propagated the Shambhala Buddhist system, and we know that he visited the Tashilhunpo monastery, which was headquarters of the Panchen Lama, one of the ruling lamas of Tibet, as we've said, and probably the most esoteric in terms of teaching. There are tunnels beneath Tashilhunpo monastery which are connected to the legends of Shambhala, and if we look at this in another way, Shambhala is a particular frequency which bridges this physical realm of the human with the angelic realm. If you look at it like that, the inner and outer Kala Chakra system, Shambhala is supposed to resonate a frequency, or an energy if you like, which emanates out and seeps out into the ordinary human world, which raises the level. So you could say it was an evolutionary initiation. And it is interesting that Rurik had the all-seeing eye placed on the dollar bill in the early 1930s, which suggests that he had friends in high places, and they also knew about this mission. A mission which you will remember was probably started in 1912 when the first, if you like, Buddhist temple was opened in St. Petersburg. And if you've listened to the other episodes, you'll know who was there. There was Dorjiev of the Buryat Mongolian Buddhist monks, who was also in touch with the Dalai Lama and high-ranking lamas. And there was also, as we've pointed out, the gentleman whose body didn't decay and predicted it, so he was probably enlightened. This is a long-ranging mission, and it affected bringing the inner teachings of Shambhala out into the West in many different forms. One of Rurik's paintings gives us a clue. It is actually based on a Tibetan legend about the horse which carries the Cintamani down from the mountain, which symbolically could present the teachings being brought out of the mountains to illuminate the wider world of the West. In another painting, which is bathed in nocturnal light and a very blue colour, deep blue, there are several Mahatmas, or enlightened ones, some perhaps representing Rigdon Jaipo, the king of the world, the mysterious ruler of Shambhala. It seems that Rurik was giving us clues, but also physically presenting objects to different people and symbols, and he left a great impression, and the mysteries of Shambhala were probably known to him at a very deep level. It was probably known to people like Vice President Wallace and members of the United Nations who financed his trips, that he had possibly in his hands the energy to transform the entire planet, to raise the level with the lamas, to continue to improve the human lot. We said earlier that the Cintamani stone was black, the black stone, but actually it was a dark green in colour by repute, and believed to be a meteorite from Sirius, which was delivered here through alien or superhuman intelligences. The Cintamani stone, it is rumoured, has always been in the possession of world leaders. Genghis Khan used it to cement his place in Central Asia centuries before. King Solomon is one who is supposed to have been in possession of it, as is Buddha. It is thought at one point to have been kept inside the Ark of the Covenant, which was also under King Solomon's purview. These temporal possessions of the Cintamani stone by those in positions of power and leadership were given as a way of giving this energy to support the systems that were in place, the wisdom, the laws, the civilization, and particular missions that were said to be taking place within humanity and the world. So really, the Cintamani stone boosts energy fields and is inextricably linked with Shambhala, as we have said. This is most certainly what Rurik believed and what he was actively promoting at the time. But the most illustrious possessor of the stone was Taslavu, the all-powerful emperor of Atlantis itself. He received the stone as a recipient from a messenger from the skies, so it suggests again that it may have come from an extraterrestrial origin. Cintamani is a Sanskrit word, and it means touchstone. There is an old translation from a Hindu text about the Cintamani, and if you listen closely, you'll hear quite a lot in these words. It says, "The land there is a touchstone, and the forests abound with desire trees. Material eyes see it as an ordinary place." Now, what I get from that is the Cintamani, the touchstone, is within the forests of the desire, but ordinary eyes, material eyes, just see it as a mundane place. It is a hidden land. If only we had the eyes to see it and to be with it, we perhaps would come across Shambhala. And just as the Tibetans say, it is either in your karma to see it or it is not. And perhaps ultimately that is what happened to Nicholas Roerich, but we shall never know. Thank you once again for joining me. This is the Psychic Jungle. Do join us for further episodes of the Secret Himalayas. Take care and Namaste.